The interurban railway at one time touched almost every city in America, yet most people have never even heard of it. So what was it, and why does it still matter to us today, especially communities in Chicago? To help me, I interviewed Walter Keeble, who worked for 43 years with the CTA as a railway engineer and comes from a long legacy of other railway engineers. Right now, he is the co-editor of First and Fastest, which is a publication by the Shoreline Interurban Historical Society.
Let's go back to the 1890s.
Okay.
Which is when things really began. Once electric traction became relatively well developed, which was by the mid-1890s, then people started looking beyond just villages and towns to see where electric trains could be operated. And of course at that time the main transportation mode was the steam railway. If you were going from one town 20 miles to the next town, you took the steam train. Otherwise you rode a horse. Took a horse and buggy.
Took a little bit longer.
A little bit longer. Through the muddy roads, through the dusty roads, through the snow. Not the best way to get anywhere. Well, the electric streetcar and then later the interurban was an enormous improvement of this. And it could be built relatively cheaply compared to the cost of building a steam railroad. And the equipment cost less. The operations cost less. So there was a great push to build interurbans throughout the Midwest, but also in other parts of the country. New England, the West Coast had huge systems around Los Angeles, the Pacific Electric. There were lines radiating out of the San Francisco area, the Pacific Northwest, and so on. This all took place between the mid-1890s and 1910. There was this tremendous growth of electric interurban railways. They were, in some cases, directly competing against the steam roads. In other cases, they were going cross-country and hitting all the little towns and villages that had no railroad service. So they provided service for people who wanted to travel. But who used the lines? Well, originally it was the people going from one town to the next, interurban. So in those days, there was not really very much commuting except strictly within larger cities, and there they would take the streetcar.
Now the kids that went to New Trier used to ride the North Shore Interurban to go to high school.
Oh, wow.
So that's a well-known fact, but that school was on the Shoreline route, and that was the slower route.
To get an idea of what it must have been like to stand on the platform and experience the interurban in its heyday, I talked to Nick Callis, who is a member of the Illinois Railway Museum, helping to restore an interurban electroliner to its original glory.
So the electroliners were built to go fast between Chicago and Milwaukee, and they ran on the Elf. They ran on the same track, same everything, and then once they got to Howard Street, they took off and went on their own. So they had to build these trains in such a way that they could go around those tight turns that the L went around, because the L structure really hasn't changed any since back in 1905, 1910, with all the curves and all of that stuff. So these trains had to be able to go around the same curves that the L trains went around. And also, they had to be able to use the same stations. And so the width of the trains and all of that was different. But in the design, in order to make them fit into the stations, they were narrow at the bottom. They were just as narrow as the L cars at the station level. And then the sides kind of bulged out in a nice sweeping curve. And that's where the seats were, so that the seating area was above the L station platforms, and it made it wider inside the cars for the people. So these were pretty ultra-modern cars for their times. The trains were also air-conditioned, and they had sealed windows, so you couldn't open them up. And they also had a dining section in it. One of the 4 cars was the diner. So you could sit in this train and get on in downtown Chicago and have dinner, a snack, whatever, on there, and get off in downtown Milwaukee. But when these trains pulled up to the L station, the people and the other stations across the way, and I was one of them, you'd look across, and here's people sitting in the big windows. They had bigger windows and everything. They're sitting in the windows, eating a sandwich, having a beer, and you're wondering, where do those trains go? Look how modern they are. And these things that we're riding, that I'm riding, these old brown and orange wood things and everything, and they're so old. And look at that. You know, they're sitting in there, you know, having a beer.
Yeah.
And where do those trains go? You know, so they were really attention getters.
The interurban railway sounds pretty great. It was electric powered and it connected America's cities. So what happened to it?
Immediately after World War I, the decline set in. Automobile ownership skyrocketed. There was a big push called good highways throughout the country, which resulted in the development and installation of paved roads all over the place. So now you didn't necessarily have this two ruts through the mud field to get from town A to town B. You had a nice paved road. Well, you could certainly speed yourself up if you had a car, and you could have then trucks delivering goods and things of that sort. So the interurbans had a relatively short heyday, and so by the 20s, the number of abandonments was going up all the time, and by the end of the 30s, after the Depression, huge percentage of the lines had been abandoned, and there was very little left. World War II stopped any further decimation of the ranks, but immediately following World War II, the decline continued, and so by 1963, when the North Shore was abandoned, there was virtually nothing left.
Luckily for us, however, there are still many traces left behind by the interurban railway that can still be seen today. Since the rails were often abandoned, many communities have decided to turn them into nature trails, like our very own Green Bay Trail on the North Shore. And while the interurban railway networks have mostly disappeared around the country, Chicago still retains the last authentic original interurban line in the U.S., which is the South Shore Line. It continues to carry commuters every day from downtown Chicago to South Bend, Indiana. Also, the infrastructure for the interurban railway is still used by today's mass transit organizations.
Because the North Shore Line ran on the L in Chicago until they got to Howard Street. And then at Howard Street, they took off on their own right-of-way. And part of that right-of-way is today the Skokie Swift. Well, that was actually the North Shore right-of-way that was built in 1926. It was the bypass around what was called the Shoreline Route, which is the route that they had that went through the North Shore communities alongside of the Northwestern Railroad, going through Winnetka, all of the Kenilworth and Glenview, Glencoe, all of them suburbs. They paralleled that route, but that was a slow route. And so they built this alternate route in 1926 to go around those North Shore communities in a faster way, because out there, it was out in the country back in those days.
Yeah.
There was very little settlement out that way, out west by Skokie and north there, unlike today. So they built that route in 26, and that was known as the Skokie Valley route, and that was the bypass route around the Shoreline route.
The then Skokie Valley route is now the route taken by today's Skokie Swift. The interurban railway serves as a great example of what could be, because it has been.